Um, Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming and welcome to the final Sociolinguistics lunch of the semester. I'm Aid Malinowski, one of the co-hosts or co-organizers, I guess, of Sociolinguistics lunch, along with Isa Sedrati, who is also present. So our speaker today is Dr. JPB Gerald. So Dr. JPB Gerald is a newly minted Doctor of Education from Hunter College. He works in adult education and professional development and is an adjunct professor in the School of Education at Adelphi University. His research investigates the ideologies and institutions behind the discipline of English language teaching, arguing that the discipline requires a full decentering of whiteness. With unique linkage of discourse on whiteness, language, and ability, he offers a more just vision of ELT as an alternative to the harm caused by its present-day incarnation. So, without further ado, I cede the floor to you, JPB.
Thank you, Aiden. Okay, so a couple of things about this before I start. There will be, for those it's helpful for, there'll be captions once I put the PowerPoint on. And then when we come back to have discussion like Q&A, there will be, it'll be there too. But let me tell you sort of what this is. Those of you who were here before too heard me sort of babbling about it. But I wrote an article in early 2020, like January 2020, that was published in May of 2020, which, let me tell you, some things had changed between when I wrote it and when it came out. But I didn't know that when I wrote it. So it got published in May, and all of a sudden, everybody wanted to talk to me about like whiteness and language teaching for reasons that I think we all remember from May of 2020. What happened though is that a lot of people who sort of agreed with what I was saying kept asking me, because the first article is basically like, here's the problem with whiteness being centered in language teaching. And then people said, so what would happen if it wasn't centered? And I realized that it would be a valuable thing to envision, like what would actually happen if whiteness was decentered in language teaching. So I wrote 3 articles with Vijay Ramjatan and Scott Stiller that were in Language Magazine, all of which are online somewhere on the language website now. That's envisioning what language teaching might, or English language teaching, but language teaching might look like if we actually were able to not have whiteness at its center. And then I wrote a whole book that's basically that, except a lot more tied into my actual dissertation stuff, although it's not really based on it. Like I really wrote 2 entire separate projects at the same time. And that is coming out in September, but there's more information about that later in the presentation. That's enough stalling. And I think that if people are gonna be here, they're here now. So let us start. Okay. You share a portion of the screen and from current slide, and show presenter view. Okay, that's the title, Envisioning Language Education After Whiteness is Decentered. That's my name. So the prologue, look, I am speaking to you not from very far away. I'm in Queens, but it's better known as Monsieur Lenape and Canarsie Land. I bring that up not just to make a land acknowledgement, which a lot of people are doing now, but also for what we're doing to point out that the English language has always been a tool of oppression and erasure, especially in terms of the way people teach it, dating back from how the indigenous and the enslaved were forcibly assimilated. Now, I'm going to go into that more as we continue, but I just want to be clear that it's not like after colonialism, English got mean or something like that. This is not new. So our agenda is I'm going to go over some terminology briefly. And then I'm going to talk about whiteness and hierarchization, which is a very hard word to say. Then I'm going to talk about the impact of whiteness being centered. Then I'm going to talk about the work of decentering whiteness. How do we actually do it? I'm going to talk about the envisioning, right? That's kind of the centerpiece. It seems like all these things are equal. They're not. There's just the order. And then we're going to have a discussion. By then, we'll see how many people are or are not here, whether we need to break that into small groups, we do one group, whatever. We'll figure it out later. So terminology, for those who would like it, there's a picture of glasses behind the terminology title. This is not the dictionary definitions of these terms. This is, I would say, how I prefer to use them and how I will be using them in this and in my writing. That doesn't mean you must do this. However, I will explain to you why I use these words the way that I do. Okay, so what do you call people who aren't white, right? What are some words for people who aren't white? Well, at the top of this little circle, it says non-white, right? Should we say that? Should we not say that? It's not necessarily inaccurate. There are times, I suppose, when it might be appropriate. But in that sense, you are defining an oppressed group by the oppressive group. It would be like calling women and non-binary people, just all of them just non-men or something like that, right? You wouldn't do that. So it's probably best not to do that. I'm not saying any of these words are offensive, in case anybody's confused. I'm just saying what would I actually prefer to use for these groups. Over here, you've got POC, BIPOC. I would hope people know what they stand for, but if they don't, people of color, right? Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Sometimes people say Black, Indigenous, people of color. Sometimes people say Black, Indigenous, and people of color. You all can argue about that yourselves. I don't really care. But the point is, these terms were originally created out of solidarity among groups, right? They were created by people of color. The point of singling out the B and the I is that, especially in the United States, but not just the United States, Black and Indigenous people have a particular relationship to whiteness, it's historically especially, but this is not to say that other people of color are not harmed by whiteness. Now, are these words fine? I think that they are appropriate sometimes. I have sometimes used blank of color to refer to myself or a group, right? I'm in a group called the Scholars of Color in Language Studies. We chose the name, so we certainly don't find it to be offensive or whatever. However, what you will sometimes see, perhaps on the internet, but wherever you're having some discourse, is that, let's just say, white folks often use these words when they really just mean Black or Indigenous or a different race. And if they really want to discuss these things openly, you should be more specific. Again, are there times when the entire grouping needs to be put together? Probably, so they're fine. But like, the point is, be specific if you can. Below that, it says minoritized. Now, why minoritized? Well, I'm actually, in the new job that I have, one of the places that the people in the company work is Detroit. Detroit is as they say, majority minority city, but it's not just majority minority, it's like 80% Black in Detroit proper, right? But in the law or in various policies, you would still call Black people in Detroit like an ethnic minority or racial minority, even though they're not the numerical minority, right? Now, should we necessarily be defining people by how many people live in a place? No. But also what's important about this, and with the I's, whenever you see IZE, right, it's showing that there's a process, that this is something that has occurred. So with minoritized, what we're really saying is that a person or a people has had power taken from them or denied to them, right? So when you're saying minoritized people, you're saying that this group of people has less power than the other people, whether or not there are more of them in one place or another. Now, the only reason that I wouldn't always use minoritized for race and racism is because you can be minoritized and not necessarily be a person of color, right? You could be minoritized and be a woman. You can be minoritized and be queer, a lot of things. You aren't inherently minoritized if you are these things, but you certainly can be minoritized by being those things. So the reason I'm pointing that out is to say that minoritized isn't necessarily tied to race, right? So I wouldn't always use that just to refer to an instance of race or racial oppression or something like that. Marginalized, very similar to minoritized. You probably know this word better because it's been around longer. But again, that's not specific to race. But the one I like is racialized. Now, there's a lot of discussion around this word. I like this word because it shows, first of all, like I said, it's a process. It's a series of decisions, right? Categories were created They were at some point malleable, although I think they've ossified a little bit. And it's showing that people are racialized as something depending on their context, right? I'm racialized as Black here in the United States. Do I feel as though I'm Black no matter where I go? Of course, but I'm certainly racialized differently when I've been to the Dominican Republic. I've been racialized differently when I was in Asia. This is not saying that racialization is inherently being treated with racism, but that it is a process and it's context dependent. So I often use racialized when I refer to what others might call people of color, just to show that these are the people who have been placed into racial categories that are not white category. Okay. So some quick definitions, and these should be obvious to folks, but I bring them up so that we don't have any confusion. Racism is racial discrimination and societal oppression combined. All right, anyone can experience the former, only certain groups can experience the latter in conjunction with the former. Everyone, however, has the opportunity to perpetuate racism, including you and me. You've done it, I've done it. Okay, you may not think that you perpetuated it because you weren't out there with a noose or something like that, but there's a lot more to racism than that. And I think a lot of people are not comfortable sitting with the fact that we have made choices that uphold this system. But we have, and you have, and I have. There's many forms of racism. Sometimes it's better to be more specific, right? One of the issues 2 years ago was that all the companies wanted to decry racism, but they could not put the word Black in their mouth or fingers because it's a typed statement. So if you want to refer to certain aspects of racism, right, maybe put the group in front of it. You can say anti-Black racism, you can say anti-Asian racism, you can say anti-Muslim racism. Okay, there's many forms of it. And I know that Islam is not necessarily a race the way we necessarily think of these things, but I defer to Muslim scholars on it and they classify it as such. One more important thing is do not say race when you mean racism. What I mean by that is if you read a news story about someone who was unfortunately killed by the police, I can bet you that news story might say that this person was killed because of their race. No, that person was killed because of racism. Race has never actually hurt anybody. It's racism. Continuing. Anti-Blackness. Well, it's basically the same thing as anti-Black racism. Okay, it's just another way to say it. It's oppression of Blackness, Black people, Black languages. When I say Black languages, I also mean the way that Black people use language or the way that Black people language, right? Not just languages that are primarily spoken by Black people. This is one of the most historically reliable paths to whiteness, although again, I don't know that that's true anymore, if only because it's harder for racial categories to change now. But, late 19th century Irish and Italian immigrants becoming police, other European immigrant homeowners helping to exclude Black families from suburbs. Was it those groups' fault that this was the path to whiteness? No, but did it happen? Yes. And I like to include this quote, what's the life expectancy for Black guys? The system's working effectively. That's why. When people say, what's the system coming to? The system was always like this. White supremacy is kind of obvious, all right? It's the idea that whiteness is superior to other racial groups. But I bring it up to contrast when people refer to, what some on the public stage, including some former presidents, are advocating. It's not just white supremacy, but specifically white nationalism, right? There's a nuanced difference, but like white supremacy is just sort of what we live in, but I'm going to kick even quote unquote legal immigrants out. I'm going to build this wall, all this stuff. Like there's levels to this thing. And I think that sometimes the news has gotten very comfortable saying that this person is a white supremacist, but like we need to be clear that people like Tucker Carlson are like white nationalists. But whiteness is the main point I'm trying to make, is that the concept of whiteness from more or less the 16th century, although the boundaries are fluid, was created specifically to be supreme. It wasn't just describing the color that people were inside of, right? Because we've had that since there have been people. But the category that we know of today was created to be supreme. So ultimately, there's no functional difference between whiteness and white supremacy. And I don't mean white people. I don't mean people with light colored skin. I mean whiteness as an ideology, as an idea, and as a system. So with that as a backdrop, let's talk about, and there's the word that's hard to say, whiteness and hierarchization. I think you will probably understand already that what I'm going to say is that whiteness, you can't have whiteness without hierarchization, right? So let's talk about ability. I mean, ability versus disability, right? So the conceptualization of ability and disability, right? The way it was built and thought of follows the conceptualization of racialized groups. You can look at the history, particularly in the 19th century, and you can see that, you know, there have always been people who we would look back at and see, well, that person couldn't walk, that person, you know, had trouble seeing, that sort of thing, obviously. But the way we think of disability wasn't really codified until, you know, 19th century, and especially how we define intelligence, and particularly IQ, just reifies racism and classism, you know, a whole bunch of other isms. And then, of course, when what does that have to do with language teaching, Justin, right? Well, those we classify as linguistically deficient are also seen as less able. Why is that? Well, let's go back to settler colonialism, because that ties into ability as well. So colonial subjects, and of course, one could argue that there are many people who are still colonial subjects, but I'm referring to the past, were viewed as childlike and less than fully able because of their supposed linguistic deficiencies. I wrote this, I said this like 8 times. I don't know why I'm stumbling over my words. When you think about it, and there's plenty of records of this, people who got closer to speaking the colonial language were seen as more civilized, right? And by being more civilized, they didn't need to be, you know, taught or raised out of the culture that we thought of as deficient. By we, not we, but, you know, the people who lived here back then. So the imposition of standardized English has always been a central part of the colonial project. They couldn't take over these lands and not include a linguistic imposition, right? So, but then our current industry emerged out of our ongoing colonial efforts, because that's how people ended up teaching English to people who didn't speak it before, right? And to this day, languaging outside of the standard is viewed as deficient rather than an equal variety. Some of this, if you are sociolinguistics folks, you probably know some of this, but I'm trying to connect a lot of things together that people don't always think of at the same time. So all this is to say is that whiteness is the goal of language education. What language educators are truly promising to students, even without understanding that they are doing so, is the chance to get closer to intelligence, to get closer to ability, to get closer to whiteness. However, this is an ideology that depends upon exclusion and supremacy. So this promise is doomed to be broken, and no racialized speaker of English can truly become white just by learning the language. So what impact does this actually have, right? What's the impact of whiteness being centered in language education? Well, there's a couple of quotes that I used in that original article. In ELT, race and language are also components of the aesthetic labor of teachers. To look good is to be white, while to sound right entails speaking an inner circle variety of English. For those who are unaware, right, the inner circle, US, UK, Canada, that sort of thing. And another quote, I recall a complaint made by a parent to the clerk in 2009 that her child was being taught by a teacher of Indian descent. The teacher, who was born and raised in the UK, was a native speaker of English, who was perceived to be someone who speaks quote unquote with an accent because of her experience. So because we think of English as belonging to a certain group of teachers, right? A certain group of people, then those who are outside of it cannot possibly be qualified, even if they have every credential necessary. So then for racialized students, though, the linguistic marginalization of students of color just serves to reify our extant status quo. And when addressed, we deflect and distract. We raise our altruistic shield to avoid addressing the racial disparities in our field. Altruistic shield is just, it's a concept that I created, but it's basically like, we believe that what we do is inherently good. So therefore, when we're challenged on racism, we don't want to deal with it. And we say, but my work is inherently good. Anyway, Ms. Matthias explained, since the teaching force, curricula policies, and teacher education pipeline are white dominant, the context for repressed forms of violence is maintained. If disruptive, white performative recurrences of anger, avoidance, guilt, dismissal, and repression stifle race knowledge. So how do we get rid of it though? And these are only my suggestions, but some of the things that I've said, the work of decentering whiteness includes, there's some big structural changes that need to change. Okay, that's kind of tautological, Justin. Journals and publications, we need a dedicated space for race and language. How many times in the last 2 years have there been journals who said, well, we need to have a special issue about the race? But first of all, a special issue can easily be dismissed by the people who don't want to pay attention to this sort of thing. And second of all, we can't, if we're going to believe in the journal system, which is a big if, but if the journals are going to exist, we need a place that's dedicated to this thing where the best of this can be found. Because when I'm doing research for articles on race and language, I got to go to the language places, I got to go to the race places, I got to go to the education places. Okay, fine, I can do that work. But like, if you're doing a different intersection, you usually have a particular home you can go to. Professional orgs, right? So the boards, the leadership priorities need to explicitly counter racism. Big TESOL, they're very big on making statements, and they have like a DEI committee and that sort of thing. But if the fundamental structure benefits the credentialing of whiteness, which most organizations do, then you're just window dressing, changing window dressing. But individual changes, because frankly, as much as I know that you need structural changes in order for the field to change, ultimately it's individuals who listen to me talk. So I can give out individual advice. White teachers, not just white teachers, but especially white teachers, just need to interrogate what it means for them to be inside of whiteness. What can you do with this, right? How can you not depend on aspects of it that haven't been earned, or how can you use what you've received without having earned it to challenge the structures in the field? I think that the race and language scholarship needs to become sort of language teacher canon. You shouldn't be able to get out of your degree program without studying it, because you will be not as good of a teacher. And look, I'm talking about teaching, and some of you are gonna be like, well, I'm a linguistics person, I'm not really a teacher. Fine, but still, you shouldn't be able to get out of those degrees without the same thing. And I know sociolinguistics also should seem obvious, and yet you've all met sociolinguistic folks who don't know these sorts of things. So anyway, but we need to build together and create communities where these issues can be discussed openly and forward action can be taken. All right. So if that means you don't have a community in your school or in your discipline where you feel like you can just sort of pick these things apart, right? You got to build one then, right? Because there's no shortage of ways to contact and build with people. We've all known over the last 2 years, you can build people around the world online. So, get to it. But let's say we succeed. Great. ELT after whiteness. What would that actually look like? All right. We tackled this through a few different realms. The first place that we tried to address was in the classroom. Now I'm talking about teaching English like as an additional language, or teaching English as such. But this doesn't necessarily just go for English. Doesn't necessarily just go for language. However, that's how this is focused. So in the classroom, we need to unstandardize English, right? That doesn't mean you need to change the way that you talk. If you usually use standardized English, don't fake something else. That would be, no, just don't do that. But we have to stop framing standardized English as the only desirable form of the language, right? Now that might go for your materials, but it also might go for the way you assess people, right? And we need to teach the variety surrounding a school's location, comparing the equally valuable differences. If you were to teach in the Bronx, you should probably, it depends on the part of the Bronx, but like you should be prepared to teach, or listen to at least the English of the people who live around you or who live around the school, right? It shouldn't just be what's being handed down from on high and the people are coming in and they're speaking English, but because it's not standardized, it's not going to be as accepted as, what's in the textbook. Speaking of that, we need to rethink how we define intelligibility, because even when people sort of listen to me and they understand that we need to do things differently, they'll still say, well, the person has to be intelligible. It's like, but intelligible to who and why, right? So we need to train students and teachers to listen to and understand wide varieties of the language. This is not hard to do, by the way. There's actual research coming out of University of Oregon where to learn how to understand different varieties of English for like a quote unquote native speaker is much easier than the people learning the language to get good or fluent or whatever you want to call it at the language. That doesn't mean we shouldn't teach the language. However, it means we need to go at least 25, 30, 40% of the way so they're not doing all the work, and make sure that we know, okay, I'm just picking a country by chance. I have 6 Korean students in my class. Okay, let me go and find audio files so that I can understand everything that people who've been trained in Korean might be saying. Right? You don't necessarily have to pick up on every language your students speak, because maybe you have 10 different languages in the room. You're not going to know all that, but you should be able to understand what they're saying when they're speaking English, even if you quote unquote can't understand it. So then in training, in terms of how people are going into the field, and I honestly, for the classroom is one thing, right? And I have my book doesn't have that much on the pedagogy, because I do think it's so context dependent that trying to say this is going to work in your classroom is a good way for a teacher to make a bunch of money selling bad books. But if you actually really want to think about how your pedagogy changes, it's going to be a lot of this other stuff that really has more of an impact on it. Frankly, I think that like lesson plans, that sort of thing is the easiest thing to do of all these things. But anyway, so in training, we need to talk about a convergence of interest. And yes, I'm flipping around the concept of interest convergence. But what I mean is that we need to prioritize racialized epistemology or thought in educating new teachers. So when you start your program to become a teacher or a professor, because I feel like not enough professors are trained in teaching, which is an issue, we need to make clear that white educators can and should take part in building this new future. The centered whiteness harms white folks too, especially white folks who want to do things differently, right? We need to train teachers to encourage racialized students to challenge any observed hierarchization in language. Now that sounds like a high-minded thing to say, right? Like just tell them to challenge things, but like you can see how that would work. Maybe you don't have control over your textbook or something, right? Well, then you and the racialized students can look at the textbook and talk about how certain varieties are being prioritized over others when there's nothing wrong with the way that they're talking. That's just an example though. We need to disbelieve the native speaker paradigm. We need to move away in all teacher education from prioritizing the language of the so-called native speaker as a standard bearer. All I know is when I got to South Korea to start my career in 2008, I was prized as this expert on the language when I had never taken a language class in my life. I mean, I took French classes, but you know what I mean. I never took an English language class in my life, and I had only ever taken 1 week of teaching, right? And I talk about this a lot in my book, but like the fact that, completely unqualified people are doing a lot of the teaching around the world is a problem. We need to also ensure that supposedly what we call them non-native teachers are given additional support while being prepared for the field, because we've been talking about this native non-native speaker thing since before I was born, since like the early 80s. There's been articles about how it's a problem that we focus on native speakers. And here we are 40 years later and none really changed. There's another thing we can do is that people who have learned English later in life and want to become teachers, they're not given additional support for the fact that that is often a really challenging thing. Right? So if you have a quote unquote non-native teacher who's coming through the training, there should be support built in for non-native, and especially for racialized non-native teachers, so that they don't just have to flounder around the field forever, the field which is already a challenge to be in, but particularly for these folks. Speaking of the field or the industry, we need to turn outward. I propose these changes to the field, but I don't want people to think that we only should care about how language is taught. I think that, I know maybe I'm Pollyanna about it, but I think if people were to really dig in on these issues, they could proliferate and actually push forward justice in other ways. Like language is the entry point for me to get at whiteness. But it ties into so many things. It ties into housing, it ties into healthcare, it ties into everything. And I think as language folks, we have the opportunity to challenge these things, and as long as we don't stay in our little ivory bubble. So we need to use language education to fight oppression in the broader world. Let me give you an example. Teachers and students could engage in some sort of action research, right? where they interrogate and challenge local employers' aversion to hiring racialized foreign, quote unquote, foreign accented applicants, which is the potential to change hiring processes, right? You can't legally, at least in the United States, put, I don't want anyone to work for me who has a foreign accent. But there are signals in job applications, which you can tell would exclude certain people. Well, students and professors and teachers could look at these things, analyze them. We could even contact employers to interrogate them about that. That seems like it's a reckless thing to do, but they're doing reckless things by excluding people, so that's their problem. Anyway, the uncanon of lived experience. I don't like canons. If a canon is going to exist, it should be based on the lived experiences of the people who are learning and using the language, right? Expertise would be sought from students, communities, and histories. The ownership, the quote unquote ownership of English would be dispersed among all. In a world that is global, and I mean that in both good and bad ways, but the fact is you could talk to someone from any country on the world right now if you wanted to, and therefore English, despite being named after a particular place, should not belong to a particular place or people. And finally, and I mentioned this already with the University of Oregon thing, we need to teach the perceiving subject. That's what, Flores and Rosa identified the white perceiving subject as the real obstacle in terms of language education. We place all of the blame, all the energy on top of the students, especially the racialized students. But if we as listeners, and I'm not white, but I'm still, in that realm of quote unquote native speakers, put a little bit of effort in to learn how to perceive different versions of the language, it would go a lot farther than all of the money and effort we throw at fixing people who aren't broken. So majoritized practitioners must be taught to perceive and listen more effectively to minoritized and racialized Englishes. Finally, and here's the one picture you'll see, don't do this in this picture. In this picture, you will see, well, I guess you only see two entire faces, but basically you can tell that these are people, young people holding flags from their countries. To be really descriptive, one's white and one's black, but you can tell that there's a lot of half faces where the people are not white, and they're just sort of showing off their diversity. This was a picture from the Princeton University homepage. For those who can't see it, it says Meet Princeton on it, so you can tell. And let me tell you, when I was a Princeton student, and I was on that page more than once. So my point is, don't do this Captain Planet, we have one from every group thing. Any organization who listens to what I say and it's like, well, we need to just get one more of them. No. All right, retaining the same ideologies but diversifying for financial benefit is not anti-racism and it's not decentering whiteness. It's just keeping the power in the same place. So don't do this here, okay? Because Princeton hasn't really done anything different. I have a very short conclusion, which is really just a summary, and then we're going to talk. So that's a lot of words there. So long as whiteness remains centered in language education and in education overall, our racialized learners will never be truly safe in the classroom, and our racialized colleagues will never be safe in the industry, which also goes for academia, not just ELT, EFL stuff. We will always be placed outside of the structures of both power and love. We need to break the ties that bind our field to historical legacies of white domination and move towards a vision wherein the full humanity of all of our students is prized. This will not be possible without a radical shift in the way that language teaching is conceptualized as a vector for whiteness. So let's talk, okay? What we're gonna do now, and then at the end, there will be time for us to just question. But for now, I'm going to make you all talk. There are about 20 of you. So I don't know if Aiden or was it Isra wants to do this or give me the ability to do this.
Yeah.
We're going to get into smaller groups and I'm going to tell you 3 things to talk about, and then we're going to come back together and we're going to talk about all of them together, and then we're going to talk just generally. So that's what we're going to do.
Okay. I made you co-host, so I think you should be able to set up breakout rooms to your liking.
Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. Let's put people into breakout rooms. There are. Okay, I will put the questions in there shortly. You go to your rooms. You too. Okay, I'm going to broadcast a message to all.
Can you tell us the third question, which went by really too fast and we couldn't read?
Oh, they don't stay up there?
No.
Ah. I was just asking what else you might do in your lives that's not just in your careers that could do things differently.
Okay, in our case, I think it will work.
So they just as a quick review, the three questions that I gave you were, first of all, how has whiteness impacted your life and career? And then it was, what could you do differently to challenge and decenter whiteness in your context and in your field? And then what might you do differently to challenge these concepts outside of your work? Because one of the main findings of my dissertation was, the dissertation, I interviewed white teachers. They weren't necessarily language teachers. But I think the concept's the same. And I did not expect this necessarily. Every single one of them was trying to challenge whiteness in their context because they were supposed to. That's why I was interviewing them. That's what the sample was. But also, despite the fact that they weren't particularly successful in their jobs at challenging these things, they had all changed their lives. And there were a few things I found in the dissertation, but one of the main things is that you can't just do this work at home and then not do it at work. And you can't just do it at work and not take it home with you. It kind of has to be the kind of thing that and if it's always a heavy lift, then you're probably not doing it right. I'm not saying it should be easy, but it's I got to a point a few years ago. For me, the example was running, is that I got to a point where it was harder for me to skip a day I had planned than to push myself out the door. Because then if I didn't, I'd think about how I wasn't doing it. So right? But it's the same way with this. And for me, it's not too different where I'm watching a TV show and I'm thinking about the idea. I'm like, come on, can I just watch the show without, it's just, can I just watch the comedy? Right. And what are you going to do? The TV show exists. Are you calling the company? That's not another great example because fine. But in terms of what I want you all, you can start, putting in talks, ideas, and start to bring forth some of what you talked about in the rooms. I saw some of it, but obviously I only saw portions of everybody's conversations. So if you don't say anything, I'm going to call out the things that I saw. So, start thinking. But you can tell that I really was a teacher for a long time, right? I still am, I just teach adults. But is that just as an example, I had some friends is the wrong word. Some people I know who I knew one of them from my days in Korea. And he lived here in New York. And then during the pandemic, they bought a house. A lot of people did that. By itself, that's not a problematic thing to do. They were living in New York and they bought a house, which one presumes they bought the house that they could afford, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to buy it. But I'm saying they don't have $1 million in the bank, you know what I'm saying? And this town is 94% white. Now, that's really hard to do if you are in a close enough commuting area to New York City. That's very hard to do when you're close to New York City, right? Do I think that the two of them specifically looked for that? No. In fact, that's the point. There's people in that town who clearly like it that way. But my point is, if you care about these things and you have a small child and you choose, and it's fully your choice, not I moved here for work, or because I know in academia, you just end up in random towns sometimes, fine. But if you have the choice and you say to yourself, well, it is the rational choice to do this, and therefore raise my child in a place that's fully surrounded by whiteness, then you can't really say that you care about this stuff, is my point. Because like what they're doing, the actual act is not like racism. They bought a house, right? But all of the things that go into it. And also once you make that decision, you're not going to burn your house to the ground. You must keep, you're going to have to care about that property value, right? This is the kind of thing that happens. You buy a place and you say, well, I got to make sure my property value stays high. And then you wonder why the neighborhood doesn't change, right? And you have to be invested in that property value or else you're going to lose your investment, because that's how it works. And once you started to make, following what they call the master narrative, right? Then it's really hard to get off the train. So like a lot of what I was writing about in my dissertation was about people who were choosing to no longer follow their master narrative. It's not their fault that they were raised in it. We all were. We're all raised in slightly different versions of it, but we all were. We all know that what you're supposed to do, right? And to me, when I talk about what you're doing outside of work, a lot of it is like, are we all doing what we're supposed to do? And I'm not telling anyone who like doesn't have any money not to take a job. Like I'm not saying that. Okay, before people say, well, you know, stop. But it's like, if you have an actual choice, and in a lot of things we do, and a lot of things we don't, then what choices are we choosing to make in terms of perpetuating this system or breaking free from it? And will we all make choices that uphold it? Yes. It's not so much never making the wrong choice, it's being conscious of the fact of when you do. And maybe I can make a better choice when I have a different choice in a different place. So that's enough of a preamble. I saw you all had things that you said in your talks, so I will call them out in a moment. But if any of you want to bring forth some of what you were discussing in your smaller groups, this would be the time to do so. So if anyone would like to start to bring something forth before I start calling on people based on what I saw in short snippets.
Can this be about any of the questions?
Yeah, anything that came up, anything, yeah.
Okay, as a teacher, I'll jump in because I spend all day doing this, waiting for people to jump in and answer and staring at them until it's too awkward. One thing that, so I am a sociolinguist and I teach linguistics, and I'm very focused on different dialects and all of that. I was kind of stumped by the question of what do you do that's outside of language studies, just because I can't think of a lot of things that I do that are outside of language, I guess. But your example of like just when you have a choice of where to live, that really helped me understand what that question was about, that it could be, because I know I do challenge people's ideas about language and dialects and non-standard things, you know, outside of my job, just in life. But I'm trying to think now of what are other choices like that. I don't have an answer to that right now because you just gave that example, but it struck me as like, oh, okay, that's the sort of thing you were asking about, and I'm really interested to kind of introspect on that more now. But the other thing I was thinking about with teaching, since I'm not teaching language specifically, is to think about how I grade writing. And you know, even if you do, you know, make little marks and stuff on it, but think about what's actually going into the grade and making sure I'm placing most of the value on content and not on the language, which is something that's pretty hard to train out of yourself, I think, after how many years in academia. So that's something I'm gonna try to do more of.
Yeah, and the class that I teach at Adelphi, I mean, it's online, but so I pretty much only have what they're writing is, I mean, there's other, we've done it sort of multimodal, so like they can put up videos or whatever, but I mean, like a lot of what they're sending in is writing. I don't really know these people beyond what they're writing. And when you talk about unlearning these things, it's really important, because if I'm not in this position, but if I were in the position that a lot of academics are in, where I had a million, trillion, billion grading things to do at the same time, right? That's, I think, when it becomes hard to move away from the lessons that you were taught, because like you have to think about not doing the thing. And when you have no time, that's when the thinking is harder to do.
Which is right now, but
yeah.
we all have piles of final papers.
Yeah, so I thank the people for joining me for this, and then you can all be having existential crises when you go,
Back and try to start.
do your work. But like I remember I teach, one of the people I teach is like, it's people outside of the school can join, but it's also people on the campus. And so I have like a couple of people who are actual undergrads there. And I have this part of me, I'm just like, I see you, right? I see that freshman in college writing style. I see it. You did exactly what the question says, and you like restated the sentence. I'm like, I see it, but I'm like, calm down, Justin. Just did she put some effort into expressing these thoughts? And then yeah, and I'm like, well, then I don't really care. It's the same thing when I review articles for journals, like especially because I really want to challenge what's acceptable language, right? But I also know I'm not the only reviewer. So if I don't say anything, am I not just setting them up to have them rejected by the other person, right? So it's not, don't say anything. I think a lot of the time it's how you frame what you're saying. So like when on the reviews, they give you the option of sending private comments to the writer. What I often do is not put public, it's not public, but you know what I mean, viewable by the others. I send private comments to say, hey, I can tell what you're going for here. I'm gonna point out a couple of things because I know that other reviewers do this sort of thing, and I kind of want to do it from a different perspective, blah, blah, blah. And they tend to understand. You know, they usually respond that they appreciate that I said it that way. Not that I'm such a hero or whatever, but like, so yeah, it's, I think sometimes people get sort of caught up in like, I'm saying to do things differently, and people are like, well, I don't know how to do the thing that I need to do. But yeah, anyway, let me stop. Others?
Thanks. These are really interesting questions. And to recap a little bit of what we were talking about with respect to the first question, which is sort of, you know, interrogating your own whiteness, figuring out what kind of unearned privileges you benefited from in your life and things like that. I think we all confess that it's something you don't have to think about very often. And like if you really have to stop and really get some guidance in terms of really teasing out all the ways, because there are so many ways and so many ways in which we're probably not aware of how we as white people have benefited. But I mean, some things that we talked about, at least in my own case, were, I mean, I grew up in a neighborhood where everybody looked like me. You know, I benefited from generational wealth. I graduated from college without any debt because of that. People that hired me in various jobs in my life usually looked like me. So, and I could probably go on for another half an hour if I really thought about it, or much, much longer than that. So that's all. Thanks.
Yeah, when I was, the class that I was teaching on all this, not the one at Adelphi, but the one I was teaching online for about a year, the first assignment I give people is to write a racial autobiography, just like about themselves and how they understood their racial categorization. Were there moments? Was it gradual? At what point did you understand? Not just know, because I think most people find out that they're white because they fill out a form when they were a kid at some point, right? So like, I don't mean that. I mean, when did you understand what it meant to be in the category that you're in? And when there were people in the class who were not white. And when I asked them, they were like, yeah, you know, in third grade, something happened or something like that. Right. And again, I'm not talking about when did you check off the thing on the form, which is some test you took in middle school or something or whatever. But invariably, the white people were like, you know, when I was like 25, like, or something, when they were, you know, they were adults when they really sat down to think about what it meant. They knew, obviously, it's 2022, and I don't mean that people are necessarily more progressive. I just mean like there was enough discussion of it on the television that you were aware of what category you were in. But to truly like understand in your bones what it meant, and also understanding the way that it shifts context to context is also, I think, one thing that's a challenge. It's one thing that I learned a lot from. I learned more from just being Black in Asia than I did from certain aspects of my schooling, you know, because that was really interesting because there was plenty of anti-Blackness, but it was very different because they just didn't know what to do with me. Whereas here they know what to do with me, and it's, you know, it can be unpleasant. So yeah, that's definitely useful series of things to say. Thanks for sharing, CC. Come on, I know there's more of you.
I don't want to put Britta on the spot, but I really liked your gym class analogy, which I don't know if you want to share it, or I can do it.
Yeah, no, thank you, Aiden. I am a language teacher. I teach Mandarin Chinese at Fordham, and I think a lot about what it means for me to be teaching that. And also we're trying to rethink language pedagogy. And I had this thought a couple days ago, what is the point of language teaching? And I thought about gym class growing up, which was really goals oriented, and we had our body fat percentage measured and how many sit-ups we could do, and we were graded on how good we were at sports. And it was a really huge turnoff for 90% of the class, and it made a lot of people hate exercise. And I thought, it seems like in the past couple of years now, people have really been rethinking what it means to exercise and be healthy, and to move away from this idea, like if you have, 10% body fat and can't do 30 sit-ups in a row, you're unhealthy. And I wondered, like, what if we rethought language teaching or teaching in general to be more on sort of a, hey, immerse yourself, try it out, move away from a goals-based pedagogy, especially for learning a language, and maybe other teaching as well, to something to get people just to enjoy the activity and not have to worry about how good they are or if they're measuring up.
Yeah, one of the chapters, the one I've given a talk on before, is I had a lot of students, this is years ago, but last time I was teaching language itself. Like, I teach about language now, but like actually teaching English as such in 2016. And I had all these students who were, the group I'm talking about, they were pretty much all women from Japan. And this doesn't have a ton to do with what I'm saying, but just for the context. And they would always come to me and I would assess it was my job. I mean, I ran the program and I was the one who also did the intake. So I would assess people, say, okay, tell me a little about yourself, why you want to take the English class. And they'd always tell me, oh, I'm bad at English. And that, first of all, it's not really a helpful answer. But also, I always thought, I can't tell you I'm bad at in Korean. Like, if I was, I'm not saying people are good and bad, but I'm just saying in the sense of like, if I have the wherewithal to express how bad I am in a language, I'm probably not that bad at it. I mean, in the context of us using good and bad. So one of the ways I got really into understanding this, and I hadn't read the Flores and Rosa work yet. It had just come out. It was 2016, so it had just started to come out, but I was not really in the academic space. So I didn't really know all this stuff yet. And I thought, because I hadn't done the work yet, that, okay, I know that something harmful is happening with ideologies in these students. They clearly need more confidence. Yes, but that was still placing the problem within them. So I did help them with their confidence in the language because, frankly, they really didn't need a lot of help with the grammar and all that. But all they did was get more confident in our classroom, because I hadn't thought about and hadn't learned about the way that the perceiving subject and so forth is involved in the way that people communicate out there. Because like these people, maybe if you'd never heard anybody speak English who was not from the United States, you could like for a 1/10 of a second have to pause and then try to understand what people are saying. But anyone else can understand what these people were saying, you know? So the only thing was who's doing the perceiving and what ideologies did those people have. So yeah, I think moving away from being the best at a language, you know, is I think, like I said, I talked about hierarchization. Once you start ranking in terms of these things, like you're just going to end up with the same sort of results, even you try to rank in a benevolent way. You know, this is what I say, people say about like good stereotypes. It's like a quote unquote good stereotype of one race being good at something still implies that some race is bad at it. So, you know, Mickey, your light went off.
Yeah, that probably has to do with some things that we were discussing. We didn't read the third question, which I think it was the interesting one. But we were talking about how we really have to spread the word about these things that are very rarely discussed outside academia. We've got to reach beyond to, I don't know, to our families, to other fields. And we were not very, very convinced that a lot of things could, you know, really improve. But, well, privilege is invisible to those who benefit from it. So just by raising, you know, awareness about, hey, this is going on, but let's think of it, which is what you're talking about in, you know, changing the beliefs of the listener in a way, is probably something that we could do, or that we have to do.
I think that when I talk about the racial autobiography, that people who are in the most powerful position have never really had to do. And I think that that can be true for language too, right? If we were to sit down, a big theme of the book is I'm sort of threading my own racial and linguistic autobiography through it. Because as I write all this stuff about the industry, I'm reflecting on my own experience in both in my body and in the languages that I've used and how my language is seen, you know, because I'm talking a big game about how we should move away from standardized English, but the book is written in standardized English, right? It's like that meme, you know, of the like, but you know the meme I'm talking about, where the guy's like, you decry society, but yet you're participating in society, right? That kind of thing. It's just like, you know, there's not a whole lot that one can do about that, because if I tried to write in a deliberately, completely unstandardized English, you know, I don't think people would understand what I was saying. But also, it's not the way that I talk. So like, it would be really artificial. And I think the key is that if this is the way that I'm most comfortable communicating, then that's fine. It just should also be fine for other people to communicate in the way they're the most comfortable, right? It's not, it's that what the way I'm expressing myself is not better, nor is the way other people are, like other varieties, they're not better either. They just, there's no good, bad in these things, right? I think taking value judgments out of it goes a long way, but it's just really hard for people not to assign value to things. I don't know how to, like, I think that's some deep human thing of just like, well, this is better than that. And that's much older than whiteness and all of that, you know. And I didn't mean to imply, by the way, that like hierarchization came from whiteness. I just mean that whiteness necessitates hierarchization to exist. Obviously, there has been hierarchization since there were people, or probably before that. I'm sure that there are apes out there, you know, fighting about these things. It's just not these same things. Only a few minutes left here. If anybody has any sort of final thoughts, ideas.
I'll just speak very briefly. We had sort of an interesting conversation about power, and talking about when is giving up your power actually, or your privilege actually helping other people? And when is it like assuaging your guilt and just making things worse for you and not actually doing anything that changes? And like being able to know the difference, and sort of also being able to see the times when holding on to that power and sharing it versus just walking away from it can actually be a sort of better way of doing things, even if it doesn't feel as good as like giving it up. And just like thinking about identifying those differences. And there were a bunch of concrete examples between the three of us, but that was sort of the like higher level, I think, conversation.
I mean, that's the like, I just took 2 edibles, let me think about this conversation, right? That's the like, let me take a step all the way back and be like, but wait a minute, is it even a good idea to get rid, because like some of the people I interviewed, one of them's a provost, right? And he instituted new policies for hiring that were, I mean, I did not go through his hiring process, but from what he told me, much more rigorous. And then like they started to try to hire for a high up position, and he saw that they didn't have the applicant pool or a diverse applicant pool that he wanted. So he changed them again. And they ended up hiring like the school's first Black dean of business school or something like that. Now, hiring one person, okay, it's not a ton, but on the other hand, that school hadn't had anybody do that before. So if you understand that you are on your way towards something, then these things can be, but the problem is people are like, I'm done, right? And so you could be him, and you could be like, if I was him and I'm soaked in all these things I'm learning, I could be like, these hierarchies are bad, I'm gonna quit. Okay, so now who's gonna do it? There's still gonna be a provost. So like, it's just like, and it's the same way I feel about all this, silly racial committees I've joined over the last 2 years. I mean, like, I joined them because I'm just like, even if my identity and my experiences weren't what they are, I literally study this. Like, if there's anybody who should be here, it's me, but they still don't listen. But then if I quit, it'll be worse. So, and that's not, no, the committees aren't necessarily power, but it's just like, but that's the thing, right? That's the thing. If people identify as white, and this is not just about race, but that's what the lens is here. We are told to do so much to try to push things forward. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, we can't just do it since y'all are still there. So you have to think about ways, and it's challenging because I don't know that I can tell people exactly what to do, and I don't think that that's really helpful, because then if I tell you that it doesn't work, you're going to tell me I screwed up. But also, like, I'm not in a person's life. I can't say exactly what would work in each workplace. Like, I give people, ideas for what they can do in their workplace, but I don't know what their job is like unless we're literally colleagues. So most of the time I say, you're going to have to try a few things out, and you can't stop. You have to keep going, like, forever. And people don't want to hear that part. Like, well, no, this will take a few years. No, it's literally never going to stop. And it sounds terrible from the outset, but once it becomes the rhythm of your life, like, it's actually not so bad. I don't know. Obviously, to say that you're never going to be done. Well, I have to go in a second, but let me say one thing for both of these things is that my last job really thought it was doing stuff on race. Like, they were like very proud of themselves, and they weren't doing anything. My current job, first of all, they don't have like a DEI person, because the entire place is actually like, the people in power are not monochromatic. So like, they don't need a DEI person. The whole place is equitable to some, and it's not even like it gets whiter as it goes. No, it's not. Like, it's like an unusual place in that way. And if you talk to them about racial justice, they'll say, it's a work in progress. But then the places that aren't doing anything will be like, look at what we did. I think the search for finality is the same as the search for hierarchization. It's the same, you know, like, let's conclude this. Like, obviously I wrote a book, the book had to end. So like there's obviously a limit to this, you know, like I can be post-structural all I want, but just like this talk, the thing has to end. But moving away from that search for like a period at the end of the sentence, I think does a lot. It's disorienting to not have a conclusion, for it to always be a horizon, like you're never going to get there. But in a way, when it becomes a sort of the rhythm of things, it can actually be itself liberating. So I'm going to put some contact stuff here. I'm very easy to find, but I appreciate all of your time and attention this afternoon. All that stuff is there. And yeah, I hope you all enjoyed your time. I have to go back to my job now. So
Thank you so much, JPB. Let's give JPB a big round of applause for this wonderful session.
and you all can, yeah, like I said, I'm easy to count. I don't know what am I pointing at, like you could see my screen. But yeah, I just put it all in there in the chat, so feel free to reach out. All right, I have to go talk to my colleague.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you too. And thank you everyone who has joined our sociolinguistics lunches this semester and this school year. I think I speak for both me and Isa in saying that it's been wonderful leading sociolinguistics lunches this year, and we hope to see you in the fall. Right. I wish everybody a wonderful Friday.
Thanks, Aiden. Thanks, Isa. Great work this year.